Scholars, welcome to Chapter 1 of Computer-Mediated Communication. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what computer-mediated communication is. We're going to talk a little bit about what the boundaries are in the subdiscipline and a little bit about what delineates computer-mediated communication from other forms of communication. I'm really excited to talk about this. I hope you are too. Let's get started. So we're going to start with something that's going to seem really condescending at first. What's a computer? Now, it seems condescending because at first glance, this seems like a really self-evident question. A lot of us just sort of intuitively know what a computer is. We can point at a device and go, there, that's a computer. And yet, if we dig into it more, both the history and the future of computers may make them look and feel a little bit different than that sort of sense of knowing of what a computer is that we may all possess. So the first computer wasn't the desktop-like thing we know now. Rather, it was a room-sized machine with no keyboard, no monitor to display things. It was a series of transistors and wires, again, taking up an entire room or two. The first, what we think of now as these sort of electronic computers, was something called ENIAC. It stood for the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. This is something that was developed in the wake of World War II, initially to help us understand and decipher everything from spy codes to develop the atomic bomb. Again, big room size thing. You had to have a lot of knowledge about engineering to even use these things, let alone read the readouts. Since there was no monitor to display things or mouse to drag around, to use them, you had to reconfigure wires and change out transistors and diodes relatively regularly. They didn't in any way resemble what we think of when we sort of get that mental image in our head of what a computer is now. Those desktop computers, what we think of them now, really started to emerge in the late 70s. In the very beginning, these are really constrained to military and academic usage, and academic wasn't high schools and elementary schools as we see them now, but rather primarily universities. They were a little bit of a curiosity. They were things that could be used to track missile flight data or crunch some large calculus equations for us. But the sort of day-to-day using them as a word processor or for communication didn't really get realized until later in the 1980s. Once the 1980s came around, the personal computer, the PC, which looks much more like the desktop you see on the screen now, and that we think of when we think of a computer, started to emerge. They came into the workplace first, again, with very rudimentary word processing software, a lot of database information, the ability to put tax information in, and then things like Excel to handle large amounts of data. By the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, we started to see these desktop computers come into the home as well. Eventually, they morphed and they evolved and became computers as we probably think of them now. Much more portable, much more higher processing capacity, doing everything from running a word processor to email to high-end virtual reality. These are something that most of us probably have in our lives. We'll talk more about that in Chapter 2. And when we think of a computer, we look at that and go, oh, that's clearly a computer because it has a screen, it has a keyboard, it has other entry devices like a touchpad or a mouse. But what happens when we take some of those away and we get into things that feel like they should be a computer but no longer look like that historical monitor, CPU, data entry that we know of? We can look at something like an iPad or a Microsoft Surface, these tablet computers. They feel like a computer. They can do most things that a computer can do. Many of them have accessories and peripherals to add on a keyboard, such as you see here, or an extra mouse for those of you that like not using the touchscreens. Sure, that looks like a computer. Okay. What about your smartphone? Smartphone can do most of the things a computer can do, from writing a letter to composing a document to checking mail, playing video games, watching movies. Yeah, sure. Okay, that's a computer. But where do we start drawing that line, especially as the boundaries of devices with transistors keeps expanding? What about your smartwatch? I can place a call, make a call, send an email. I can technically probably do spreadsheets on it. Not terribly convenient, but I probably could. So maybe that's a computer. What about a smart home device, an Alexa or a Siri? Now we know there's something computational about it, and we're still using digital infrastructure. But now it may not feel as computery. These are a little more limited use things. We can talk with them, we'll anthropomorphize them, we'll treat them as human. We'll talk more about that. But maybe they don't feel as much like a computer. What about your smart refrigerator? And this is where we go, okay, so I can send a social media message through my touchscreen refrigerator, but most of us, when we think of what's a computer, don't think of our appliances. And so we start to see the nature of what's a computer being this very evolving and changing thing. On the one hand, this gives us a lot of latitude when we talk about what is a computer. And a lot of the things we'll talk about and the things that you'll read about in the textbook acknowledge studies from the 1970s and 1980s. And I think a lot of students, their initial reaction is to say, wait a minute, computers in the 1980s weren't as powerful, they weren't as sort of omnipresent, and so it's a different thing. But really what I want to encourage you to think about as we go through computer-mediated communication is, why is it different? What makes it different? Other than just raw computing power, maybe the graphic resolution was a little higher, but what did it do differently? And so when we talk about a computer, in some ways, I don't really know what a computer is, because it can be a lot of things, everything from your desktop system to a smart enabled garage door opener. For us, though, we're going to look at computers primarily as a communicative device, and that's what's going to help distinguish this class from things like engineering, computer science, information science, and library studies. We're less interested in the device itself and the ones and zeros, the transistors, the wireless protocols, and more interested in the communication that computer and that device facilitates. And from that perspective, really landing on a solid concrete definition of a computer may not be as critical. So then why are computers interesting to us? Again, as communication scholars, we don't particularly care about the devices and the wiring. That's for the electrical engineers, or the protocols. We're not going to talk about the transfer protocols and the ISO layers. That's not part of the communication course. So what makes them interesting to us? One of the reasons that computers are really interesting, particularly as they become sort of more integrated across our lives and communicative experiences, is they really allow us to isolate and play with fundamental parts of human communication. If we rewind to 100 years ago, we had mediated communication. We had books, we had leaflets, we had pamphlets, but particularly mass communication and sort of long distance interpersonal communication was much more limited. Not everybody had the ability to print a book or distribute a newspaper. And so between the high access and then what we can do with them now, the last 100 years, and especially the last 40 or 50, has seen radical changes to the communication experience. So again, before that, really the gold standard, the thing that sort of by which all communication was judged, was face-to-face interaction. When we're in the same place, looking at each other, talking to each other, how do we interact? For thousands of years of human history, that was the default. And that's what we knew. And communication scholars early on in communication scholarship focused on that because it was so prominent. There are things that are innate to human experience that happen in face-to-face communication. The cool thing about CMC, though, was it allowed us to isolate naturally things that maybe we couldn't do as naturally face-to-face. And so, for example, we could ask questions like, how do you talk with someone when you can't see them? We can do that with a telephone, but and we'll talk about this in a moment, there's new and interesting ways to manipulate what we can see or how much we can see or what cues we can see when we interact through a computer rather than through a telephone. And so one of the things we'll talk about this semester is, again, not really focusing on the computer, but rather what does it allow us to do to isolate or focus on in a natural way to understand the fundamental building blocks of human communication. And so that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time this semester. So for example, to put this in very practical terms, why are computers interesting? Because we've gone out for coffee with friends for thousands of years. And especially the pandemic, COVID pandemic of 2019 ad nauseum, we went out to coffee in a different way. We would get a coffee in our house and have a coffee over Zoom. Those were different experiences. The ability to sit with someone, we call that co-location, when you're both in the same place, to feel their physical presence, to put your hand on their shoulder if they need sympathy, to see if they're making eye contact during this, to see if they're falling asleep even though they're drinking coffee. Whereas on Zoom, many of us experienced, or we could remember what happened when we were all on these little tiles on the screen, whether it was Zoom or Skype or some other program, where we were still having coffee together, but it was a qualitatively, fundamentally different experience. And so those are the types of questions that CMC, computer-mediated communication, really let us look at. So within communication, we can sort of take two approaches to CMC, convergence and divergence. From taking a convergence approach to communication, CMC has allowed a lot of phenomena to collapse, and in doing so, we can go back and look at what's old. Again, those fundamental building blocks of human communication. So we can do things like have new ways to isolate and manipulate parts that are fundamental to human communication. What happens when I change the tone of your voice but not the words? That's a really hard thing to experimentally manipulate, to have someone come into like a DJ recording booth and read the same phrase with different tonality. Online or through a computer, we can simply use some of the technological features and do some voice augmentation, play with the equalizers and the levels, and take exactly the same recording and have different tonalities to it. We can do things in a much more naturalistic way of what happens if you can't see social cues about the person with whom you're talking. You can't see their sports team or their gender or their physical appearance. We can put a bag over their heads in a lab, and we did. It's a lot easier now just to have you interact on Zoom and turn off the camera. Without the video to video conferencing, it gives us the same experience in a much more naturalistic way. The other way that CMC converges, it allows really nicely for cross-discipline questions. So across the different subdisciplines of communication, think about the other courses in your curriculum. You may have an interpersonal course, an organizational course, a rhetorical criticism course. You may have an intercultural class, relationship communication, communication and aging, communication and dying. It allows us to take all those different parts of the communication discipline and find sort of a nexus point to unite them and explore them. So if we want to look at things like if we want to look at things like intergenerational interaction in organizations, that can be a little hard to come by naturally. In larger organizations, there may be someone of a much older generation and some of a much younger generation, but how many are there in an organization? It's a little bit challenging. How often they interact, it limits even more. And by the time you really find a sample who wants to even participate in your study, it's really tough. Online, those interactions happen much more commonly, everywhere from formal organizations and distributed work to even just ad hoc groups that form naturally online of sort of volunteer members, support forums, enthusiast forums, etc. So one thing that CMC can do for communication is converge it. It helps us collapse things and sort of merge things together. But communication can also serve as sort of a divergent jumping off point. In other words, there are some things that are really new and allow us to look at some of the ways that humans are adapting to and taking advantage of new channels and new forms of communication. And so we have new channels of communication, new means of interacting. One of the things we'll talk about during this course is the idea of mass personal communication, this one-to-many message that's accessible to many, but it's really intended for one or a limited group of receivers, very personalized. You can do this offline, and we've seen this everything from billboard graffiti or overpass graffiti. I love you, Beth. Clearly it's meant for Beth, but anyone driving past it can see it. To proposals on a jumbotron at a sporting game. Jim, will you marry me? Well, there might be a lot of Jims at the game, but hopefully only one of them recognizes the person who's proposing to him. Online, social media are this rich, vibrant, huge tapestry for mass personal communication. So much of our socially mediated interaction is mass personal. And so it gives us a new way to explore much more regularly interaction that was a little harder to come by offline. We can explore the emergence of norms. If we look at an organization, if we look at cross-cultural organizations, how do norms in that organization form? And there's some degree of limitation. If you take something like Starbucks, there may be Starbucks-wide norms, and some of them are tweaked and augmented for Starbucks in India, Starbucks Australia, Starbucks for France, but they're never truly unified. Online, we can watch as these entirely new norms and processes form, either again for formal organizations. We've seen this sometimes with even something as fundamental as Best Buy's tech support. For a long time, we're playing online games to let tech support talk with each other across different countries. And in doing so, created this amazingly robust back channel for tech zone interaction. Lastly, we can look at new cues that emerge. Cues are bits of information, bits of data that give a sense of who we are. And those can be from everything from eye contact to gestures. Non-verbally, For a long time, we'll talk about this in chapter 3, we didn't think a lot of nonverbal cues could be transmitted through CMC, but as the fact that you can see eye contact and gestures here, that seems to be eroding a little bit. But we certainly have seen new cues emerge online. Many of you have probably experienced when you see something in all caps, caps lock, you interpret that as the sender is yelling, and you actually read that message in all caps in a louder, more intense voice. And that's a cue that really didn't manifest offline readily, even in other media channels. So even if we're writing a letter or reading a newspaper, that all caps thing really emerged primarily in online communities. It also is a divergence that it allows us to do things that just aren't practical offline. So we can do things like have high risk scenarios without running people through fields of landmines, or we can do things to them where do things to participants and see what happens in high stakes games without actually putting them in physical harm. And so we'll talk about these not only approaches, both the convergence and divergence, but also how they manifest throughout this course, looking at how mediated communication can help foster both old and new ways to understand the human experience. So with that, maybe it's a good time to talk about what is CMC. This is a thing that I've been using this acronym a lot. We'll use it a lot throughout the course. Computer-mediated communication. In a previous piece, I've defined this loosely as the exchange of meaning between two or more humans via digital technologies that emphasizes the mediation and the impact of that mediation on the communication process, rather than focusing on specific technologies. One of the common refrains you'll hear me use throughout this year is, I don't particularly care about Facebook or Twitter or TikTok. And I really think any study that is so limited to one platform or one technology is probably not any use. Imagine if you did a study 10 years ago on Friendster and the use of social networking only through Friendster. Many of you are now asking yourself, what's Friendster? Opening up a different window, looking up Friendster. It's a now defunct social media platform that was replaced by Club Penguin and Orkut, and then Facebook and MySpace and TikTok and Instagram. And so these platforms, even though they seem new, they still already have a long history of ebbs and flows and rises and falls. And so I'm decreasingly interested on particular platforms, and rather I'm much more interested on what's the aspect of human communication that platform is enabling. What does that do? And so if you hear me, or if you read in the book throughout the semester and say, well, I don't use Facebook much anymore, or I've never used Instagram, I'm going to say this with respect and scholarly love to you right now. I don't care. It doesn't matter. That's okay. Because you can put whatever your favorite platform is in there, whatever your favorite tool is in there, and it probably should work. And if it doesn't, maybe it wasn't that robust of a theory in the first place. So that definition gives us some good ideas, but it also leaves questions of what's in and what's out. And so given that definition of CMC, what do we care about? As we go through this course, what are we going to care about? What meets that definition? One thing is we can use technology to isolate. And some examples of this, and isolate communication variables. Some examples of this include studying the effect of physical presentation. Historically, when we have studies about how we interact, even if the study is not about what you look like, when you're sitting across the table from someone, you know what they look like. There are some studies, very famously, a researcher by the name of Zimbardo in 1969 did a study where he was hiding people's appearances by putting a paper bag over their head. I mean, it worked, but it was also incredibly unnatural. Online, we can use technology to isolate that and simply turn off those physical presentation cues, whether that's something as simple as an email where there's no visual cue in the first place, to an audio-visual chat where we just turn off the video and we just have a voice-only call. We can use technology to isolate things like conversational turn-taking. When you're talking with someone on the phone or over coffee, we often talk over ourselves. For those of you that have had or are about to have a qualitative communication course and have to transcribe, this will be your undoing. There's a lot, and people talk over each other a lot. Online, we can look much more naturally at turn taking, because in a text-based communication, when someone sends a message, it appears. And so we can actually see the discrete instances of who said what when and in what turn, and then much more directly trace subsequent utterances back to earlier ones. And lastly, we can look at impression formation in new ways. When you meet someone new for the first time in person, you're immediately flooded with so much information about that person, what they look like, what they sound like, what they smell like. But when you're online, those cues get throttled. And so we can make really discrete, really small, nuanced changes to a very limited subset of information to track the effect on impression formation. If you have a lot of followers or few followers, how does it change our perceptions of your social attractiveness, physical attractiveness, extroversion? If you've got a funny versus a serious versus a sort of inane versus an empty profile description, what does that tell us? And we can start using very discrete cues without having the confounding effect, the sort of unknown effect of all these other variables we're getting flooded with when we meet someone face to face. So one way we can use technology is to isolate. But we can also, so that's the convergent approach. We can also look at the divergence. What does tech do differently? One way we can do this is, again, back to physical presentation. There's this sort of very famous, or maybe infamous, depending on your role in this, example during a court case during a deep part of the pandemic when everyone was on lockdown and coming in through teleconferencing for work, where one of the lawyers in an ongoing court case logged on to the Zoom call for this court case. His kids had been messing with the Zoom previous to the call and set up a cat filter so that there was this digitally superimposed picture of a feline, so that when he moved, the cat moved, and when he blinked, the cat blinked, and when he talked, the cat's mouth opened. And the video of this is absolutely hysterical because he has to go through for the first couple minutes trying to convince, I guess, or trying to convince people that he is in fact a lawyer and not a cat. Now, of course, if you walk into a courtroom and you see a cat there and it's not a Disney movie, you don't think that there's actually a cat representing you. Online, we can do that. And these can be very big physical presentation changes. I can present myself as a sentient and acting rock or potato or cat. Or we can do something much more minor, using filters to clean up appearances and do touch-up, resolving blemishes, taking away acne, etc. And so we can change our physical presentation and affect our physical presentations in ways that we could really never do offline. And importantly, I could describe myself, if we were pen pals writing out a description that I'm a cat, there's not a lot of believability to that, versus when you see me and interact with me and I take on this sort of, I'm trying not to say fursona here because it's going to make me sound like I'm in the furry community, but taking on this very fur-enabled body, it's going to affect how you look at me and interact. Likewise, tech can also change the way that we see ourselves. So I said in the original definition of CMC, it's where we have two or more people, but there is a space, and we'll talk about this when we talk about intrapersonal communication in the course, where the other party may still be yourself, where you're serving as both sender and receiver. We spend a lot of times very deliberately picking the cues out that we send. So think about the profile photo that you've got on whatever your platform is now, whether it's Tinder or Pinterest or TikTok, whatever. Did you pick the picture of yourself where you just rolled out of bed and you look disheveled from last night's bender? Of course not. You take the picture of you that looks good. You just got a glow up. You were in great shape right before spring break, something. And so we can very carefully choose how we present ourselves. And this allows for a lot of interesting questions about how we see ourselves and then want others to see us. And we have much more manipulation or ability to control the cues than when we're face to face. And the last thing is we have this great ability to go back in time. If I meet you in person, I can ask what you used to do, but that's kind of the end of it. And you have free reign to just flat out lie. But one of the great sort of tropes online is people bringing the receipts and this you. And so having things like the Republican Party of Arizona saying there's no such thing as a president-elect, and then someone going back into their prior tweets and saying, well, you said exactly this verbiage 4 years ago. And so you're really not being consistent with yourself. And so think about now, we see a lot of people as they go out looking for jobs, employers are increasingly looking up job candidates and their social media presence. And not only that, but then going back in time. So you are not only necessarily being judged for the resume and what you're bringing now to the job, but also perhaps problematically, the dumb things you did 4 or 10 years ago in high school or middle school. And you may well have changed and grown, and that's not who you are now. That doesn't change the effect that it's going to have. So we can spend a lot of time this semester talking about what's in both of these ways, using tech to isolate sort of old phenomenon or looking at the new phenomena that tech enables. What's out then? What's not included in all this? So my litmus test is always this. is there an easy offline analog? Is there some sort of non-digital component that we could swap in and ask and answer the same questions that we're posing? And if so, maybe this isn't a study of CMC. So for example, you want to do a study looking at voice over internet protocol. So you're using the computer to have a voice only call. Well, what's the difference between using Skype to call someone's landline and using your cell phone or a different landline to call? I'm just not convinced this is computer-mediated communication. Still a great study, still a great mediated study, but it's not, there's nothing, the computer's not doing anything there. It's just being a proxy for a phone. Years ago, I had a friend of mine ask, well, I want to see what happens when we give kids that may have to be at home for health reasons. What happens when they watch YouTube videos for their class? And that's a CMC study. And I said, how is that any different than 10 years ago? And it was 10 years ago at the time. I'm old and busted, get over it. When 10 years ago, we would send people correspondence courses on VHS or DVD, and they would sit in their dorm room or their house and pop it into the player and watch the lecture. If we start looking at the kids watching YouTube videos and look at how the comments below affect our perception of the video, now we got a CMC study. But just using YouTube in place of watching something that's being broadcast over the air or on demand or through VHS or old recordings like this, there's not a CMC component to that. The other thing that's out is any study that just uses the internet or computers to collect data. We're looking at how romantic couples resolve arguments. And we did this through an online survey where we got an online panel to respond to it. Was the argument online? Were participants arguing about screen time or device use or anything like that? No, you just wanted to find out when couples argued. That has nothing to do with CMC, and the only role that the technology plays here is just to get the data. That's out as well. That's just a methodological artifact, doesn't tell you anything about mediation. And lastly, this is where it gets a little fuzzy, and different people have different views on this in the field, but we have new subfields that have emerged, either spinning out of CMC or evolving on their own and sort of parallel, but sort of distinct parts of the communication discipline that may look and feel a little bit like us, but are distinct. One of which is mobile communication. Again, we have a lot of our computational power is now on our mobile phones, but if you're just using a phone to walk around and call people at different locations, that tends to be a mobile issue. If it's not about how the technology is altering or affecting that conversation, interaction, perceptions, that tends to go into the mobile communication discipline. Second one is human-computer interaction. So for those of you that don't remember, which is probably all of you, Microsoft Office back in 2006 or so decided to introduce Office Assistants. These are little virtual pop-ups that, oh, it looks like you're trying to format headings. Can I help? And we'll try to guide you through. The most popular of these was Clippy, and Clippy got a lot of sort of undue heat. But increasingly, we see these same virtual agents on pop-ups for shopping or trying to assist us when we get a flight. But you're interacting with a computer. Clippy here is not a person. It's just this increasingly complex algorithm trying to talk to you, but you're not interacting with a person. And in fact, you're interacting with the device. Human-computer interaction is a hugely growing, vastly interesting field. But since its focus is not on the human-to-human interaction, we're not going to focus on that as much this course. Likewise is human-robot interaction, where we have that embodied computer system, whether it's R2-D2 or a little robot friend or Rosie the robot, whatever, or even just a little Tamagotchi maybe, but something physical you can see and interact with, and maybe even give some cues back to you, whether it's sounds or movement. HRI, this human-robot interaction field, great field, interesting stuff. Certainly, the human-robot interaction is going to become larger and more important in society, but it's also, without that human-to-human component stuff, not really our focus. So given that focus, one thing we can ask is, what's the role of computer-mediated communication in society? And this is where we're going to find two different types of camps of people typically. The first camp are what we call techno-determinists. These are the individuals that view that technology controls us. If you give us being humans, if you give humans a new technology, that technology will guide our use. And so anytime you hear someone saying, oh my gosh, cell phones have taken over our lives, or social media has taken over our lives, and we all just are spending our time looking at our cell phones, That's a very techno-deterministic frame, that since there are these phones here, we were inalterably going to be staring at them all the time. Likewise, the same people often say, well, social media has led to a lot of antisocial or bullying activity online. Since this technology is here, we're going to find ourselves using it increasingly for these dark, nefarious purposes. The other camp is going to be social determinists. And the social determinist is going to say, we govern what we do with the technology, rather than the technology existing, and therefore we're going to do with it what it wants. The technology is there and we can use it or not, and we can use it in ways that are very faithful to how it was intended, or we can use it in new and interesting ways. And so one of the things I often look at, back to the earlier example of when everyone's sitting around looking at their phones, and people say, oh, kids these days, even if they're 40, are all on their phones. And yet no one ever looks at old pictures of people riding the bus or riding the subway, and everyone's reading a newspaper or a book and says, everyone's on books these days. If everybody had a book in their hand, no one would blink. And so I don't think that cell phones are necessarily the nasty thing that the techno-determinists may have us believe. By now, you may have gathered I'm a little bit more in the social deterministic camp. Likewise, the same devices that allow us to bully people online, or to sort of lean into some of our lesser and worse habits, can also give us great opportunities for pro-social behaviors. One of the early and biggest areas of study for CMC was actually online support. How did remote communities or marginalized communities use digital tools to find each other and find and provide and receive social support and emotional support, and find their community? And so it's not the technology was going to do most of this, but rather the technology was there and we then got to decide how to use it. And some may use it to be jerks online, but some are also going to use it in a much more positive and uplifting way. So we're at the end of chapter 1. At the end of the chapter, there's a couple thought prompts and to get you to maybe go back through the reading and look for different things or think about it in different ways. But I don't want you to stop thinking about this. We'll talk more about the different areas and the theories guiding this in different chapters, but take a minute now before you move on and think about what's different between CMC and other sort of narrower topic courses that you've had in your communication curriculum so far. What's different from what we just went through versus your interpersonal communication class, your persuasion class, your intercultural class? What's different about this? Also, think about your own interactions. What's been new about the interactions that you have when they're online, when they're mediated in some way? Alternately, what are some of the ways that are old that you communicated? What are some of the ways that you haven't changed how you communicated? You've just moved them online. For example, you were always a little bit introverted. Now that you're online, you're still introverted, but digitally. Lastly, think about yourself. Are you a techno-determinist or a social determinist? What CMC technologies are in your life? We have a lot of them, everything from our smart devices to our alarm clocks. Which of those are